All right, so it's week 4. Today we're primarily going to talk about banking, cover some other issues. We'll talk a little bit about the term project, just so you kind of have an overview of that, and a little bit about the homework. I've got a new version of the textbook, or the newer version, so I'm going to put out those all the questions that you'll need to get before the first midterm. Expect that to be coming out about the same time that this thing will be published, so that will be available for you. Let's look. So banking and interest rates. It's not that confusing, but it is something where it's a pretty important part of your financial life. You know, who you choose to bank with. Some of these you can definitely get nickeled and dimed by fees, and some things are convenient, some things are not. Technology's changed a lot, though, so banks have to be more competitive. They have to earn your business, and so that'll be part of the homework for this week, is to kind of like evaluate your bank and decide whether they're serving you best, or perhaps it's something else to do. So anyway, banks, for the most part, we use banks, or most people use banks as just exactly what they're meant for, just transitory stuff for paying bills and things like that. Typically, if you're accruing much in the way of assets, you wouldn't necessarily want to keep it in a bank account, just because the interest rates are not much. They're not going to keep up with inflation. So the good news about bank accounts, though, is they are insured up to $250,000 per depositor, and even when a few banks failed recently, they went up and beyond those limits. This title in here, they're saying commercial banks. When I think of commercial banks, I think of like a Goldman Sachs and something like that, where you're not necessarily dealing with, they're more of a business-to-business feature, or business-to-corporation type feature. What we're talking about in this chapter are personal banking type things. The way big banks operate is a whole different means. They don't necessarily make loans. They arrange loans, or they arrange for bond sales, or do things like that. Personal banks, they do make loans, but often what you'll probably find in your financial life is when you want money, they're not interested in loaning it to you, and when you don't want it, they're trying to shower you with loans at uncompetitive rates. So it all depends what you're getting involved in, but there are a lot of options out there when you're having to borrow money. But certainly as a place to save your money, I would encourage you to keep roughly a minimal amount of money within a bank. Just the amount you need to get those transactions done throughout the month, because you are losing money. You're not necessarily losing the dollars directly, but you're losing the buying power of it through inflation. So they also try and split hairs here with savings institutions, credit. There used to be other types of savings banks, and there was a deregulation that took place a long time ago now, where most of these banks and credit unions, whether you go to Wells Fargo, which is a bank, or Alaska, it's not even Alaska USA anymore, it is global. Anyway, you go to one of those versus they generally offer pretty much the same services. So it really gets down to convenience and fees. But anyway, we'll talk more about it as we go. Non-depository institutions, so finance companies, these are personal loans. And again, your financial plan has kind of gone awry if you're dealing with these folks who just do these personal loans to individuals. These have kind of been supplanted by even other things that are even worse, payday loans and all these other things that charge rates that are just not competitive. They gets to be a little predatory, and hopefully you'll be able to structure yourself so you won't have to end up in a position where you're reliant on those folks. Security firms. So these guys, and this is, I'd lump brokerages into this as well, where this is where your big money should be positioned. Now, obviously, it may be bought in stocks, or it may be in money market accounts, it may be in something, but you're going to be getting interest rates that are way more than your local bank is going to offer. And I also like sort of the firewall in terms of spending. You don't have as many transactions passing through when you're working with a brokerage typically, and you have a little bit better identity theft protection and other things going on with the big brokerages. So I'm more comfortable having larger sums of money. And then insurance companies. Insurance companies, they kind of span from doing traditional insurance, but they also tend to get involved in some investing. But the problem is that they're not optimized for that. And because of the nature of their business, they have to be very conservative, so conservative to the point where they're, again, not super competitive. So we'll talk more about investing as we go, but insurance companies, typically not where you want to be, a lot of commissions involved and low yields. And then investment companies, this becomes more seamless with the securities firms. Those guys are kind of lumped in together. I mean, through different brokerages, and we'll look here at the end. But you should kind of become familiar with some of these big companies, because not only are they useful in your financial life, but they're also very useful in preparing your financial plan and your term project. So you can go onto their websites and you can glean a ton of information, and you will be familiar with them at some point in your career, and so this is probably a good time to start. And then financial conglomerates. So they leave that to last. And yeah, I guess you could probably use Bank of America to, I imagine they have a brokerage associated with them. But again, I don't necessarily, I don't know. Bank of America, I'm not going to, they've got the Alaska Airlines card, so I do use them, but they aren't really known for the same level of service that I would expect out of a brokerage firm. So Citigroup kind of same way. So bank subsidiaries, you accept deposits, provide loans, offer credit cards. But again, most people, you say you have the Alaska Airlines card. Well, yeah, it's associated with B of A, but it's really not that important which company it's with. Securities, the brokerage service, and the mutual funds. But we'll talk much more about mutual funds and that as we go along. And then insurance companies themselves. So checking services are quite important. It's kind of funny. I mean, we call them checking accounts, but most people don't write that many checks. There's at least, in my case, I do a whole lot more electronic debits, or I'll use credit cards for most bill paying, as long as there's not a fee associated with it. The notion of actually writing a check, it still occurs, but it's almost kind of quaint at this point. And in foreign countries, the whole notion of a check is kind of a strange thing. Checks can be awkward to deal with, although mobile deposits have gotten to be much more useful. But sometimes some of the delays and the fact that the funds are there's a delay between when you write the check and when the funds are accessed, makes it a little bit more risky. Although the time when you used to float a check for days or weeks, that's because things are processed electronically. But anyway, as most of us know, you tend to pay a lot more things through an ACH debit, an automated clearinghouse debit, rather than writing a check. You do need to pay your bills on time, obviously, and the fees are, they can be fairly brutal. One thing about this, though, bad things happen. People get late, whatever. Before you just accept and pay the fee, definitely call the folks. They won't do it if you're late every month, but if you're late like once a year, they'll waive those fees. I've never had a problem because sometimes, in my case, there will be some fraud or something on a credit card, and the credit card's used to pay the bills, and then therefore all those bills, if something gets screwed up in the process, that bill ends up being late, and they'll slap a penalty charge on there. But again, it helps to be on time most of the time, because if it's a once a year occurrence, you call and say, hey, you're charging me $35. I would like to get that waived, and they act like they're doing you a huge favor, which whatever. Maybe I'm taking advantage of it, but I've never had them not waive it. Alrighty. Debit cards. Debit cards are not a new innovation, but some of the problems with debit cards are, one, it's the notion of having like a check register where you write a check and then you write it down in the book. That maybe you're good at that, maybe you're not. But with debit cards, it's even worse because they come directly out of your checking account, and sometimes it's kind of tough to keep track of that. So the other problem with debit cards are there's significantly more laws to protect credit card purchases in terms of fraud than debit cards. That bit of delay in you using a credit card and that merchant getting that money, that provides a bit of a buffer. I know as a vendor, if I accept a credit card, it takes about 3 days to get the money from whoever. Most of mine usually came through PayPal or that's where or Square or somebody like that to process that. And anyway, if the buyer on the other end claimed fraud or claimed some sort of problem, it was pretty easy to get that money shut down because it hadn't yet been issued to me. On a debit card, trying to get that money back from a vendor when a debit card's been used is a little tougher for the bank. So anyway, the legal protections, the statutory protections aren't the same for debit cards as they are for credit cards. And then mobile banking. Again, that's what gives you the ability to, mobile deposit, for example, depositing checks. I had a check, it was just a little bit above the limit, but anyway, checks up to $25,000 now are, depends on the policy of the bank, but that is pretty convenient. So you're not necessarily locked into a bank. What you have to be careful of, and this is why, although I do have an Alaskan bank, but primarily that's because the last of my account number is 1111, which whatever, the odds of that happening again are about 0. So for stupid emotional reasons, I keep that account. But the fact, if I deposit a personal check in that account and they want to sit on it for a week, that just infuriates me. I had this happen once with a certified check, which is even more egregious. So if I send it to a bank in Texas, it's available immediately. So if the banks up here wanted my business, they would compete for it, and currently they're not. Maybe things will change. But anyway, and then we know all about all the different options that are available online. It's become the standard rather than the outlier. So monitoring your balance. Yes, this is what you should do. But I write a few checks per year. So again, most of us have kind of lose the art. And most of the time I write a check, I have to rewrite it because I screw something up in the verbiage. So anyway, and then making sure it reconciles. But a lot of times you can get the check images, which is kind of nice. And for IRS purposes, having a canceled check, there's nothing that really quite matches that in terms of the IRS, so that's nice. But other than that, just not that common. Check float almost doesn't exist much. These guys are going back over 20 years now. Anyway, now things, are processed electronically. So, deters fraud. And then Visa, MasterCard, the other ones. So Visa and MasterCard, obviously they're going to go on your bill, and then they're going to be paid in a lump sum at a later date. A debit card is going to be obviously just like writing a check. Safety deposit boxes. There generally aren't enough safety deposit boxes. There's not that much demand. If there was a safety deposit box for everybody in the state of Alaska, I don't know what the inventory of boxes are, but they're not that common. You have to pay a fee for the use of that box, and most people up here have a gun safe or whatever they're using. Something fireproof is obviously a huge bonus. ATMs, we're familiar with ATMs. Again, this is something, though, if you're being charged ATM fees that aren't reimbursed, you may want to get another bank. I don't know. I use an ATM not too often, a couple, 3 times a month. And so if it charges me, say, $3, I get all of that fully reimbursed by the bank in Texas. So that seems fair enough. If you're going across town to avoid, paying an ATM fee, you probably need to get another bank since you're burning up more in gas and losing time by doing that. So should be reimbursable. Cashier's check. So this is what really set me off with one of the banks up here. Was I had sold a piece of equipment, and so it was maybe 20 grand or something like that. I had a cashier's check. What happens with a normal check is you write that check, and you're basically promising that you have that much money in your account, because that money in your account can't be set aside until that check is actually presented. With a cashier's check, you write a check for 20 grand. Well, they move that 20 grand out of your account and they put it in a separate account. So when that check comes, it's not going to bounce. It's not going to be declined for insufficient funds. So it gives you a huge level of security. Well, the bank up here, they knew that, but yet they wanted to hang on to the money for 5 days, which was a foul. And so that's just them, holding on to the money, earning interest on my money before it's accessible to me. So, and then a money order. Money orders not that common. Those are kind of something that people that are unbanked would have to use. They're charged for a fee for each thing. I may write a money order here in a while. Your passport expires every 10 years, and that's about how often I write a money order or get a money order. Kind of awkward, but again, for unbanked people, people who don't have any relationship with a bank, they often have to use them. And you present the money, and they write you the money order. So, not necessarily the most convenient thing in the world. All right, and then traveler's checks. Traveler's checks, yeah, things kind of come and go. Traveler's checks, I wouldn't recommend them. I mean, I used them way back when, but I've been in places where, well off the beaten path, and I've had people now, because traveler's checks just aren't that common, actually been refused, and my credit card's actually fairly well accepted. So, not a lot of utility to a traveler's check anymore. So, part of the homework assignment is going to have to do with looking at some of the factors that make sense to you for when you're selecting a bank or whatever type of financial institution. Like I say, the lines are blurred. You can find one institution to do all of it, but do they do it all well? And is the security the same? Are the options the same? Some of the convenience features. A lot of times, I end up throughout the course of my life doing some very odd type things, international wire transfers and stuff like that can be fairly challenging. And if you don't have to do stuff like that, then it may not necessitate the other bank. But I've tried to do those types of transfers here in Alaska, and you literally have to go into the bank and you have to do this and do that, and where I can do it over the phone with other banks. So the online banks, out of necessity and out of wanting to be competitive, have made things somewhat easier and have potentially more online options. Will the local banks meet them and lessen their fees? Maybe, maybe not. Some consumers using Walmart to avoid fees. I do agree that Walmart does serve as a place for people that are unbanked, but you don't necessarily avoid fees. What they do is fees for service. So now that also, you don't want to fall into a trap where you have to maintain a high minimum balance to avoid the fees, because then, if it's over $1,000 or something like that, that money is just sitting there idle, and that's money that they're able to use, obviously, but you're not able to touch, so not a good thing. Interest rates on deposits, yep, certificates of deposits, and risk-free rate of returns. So interest rates, definitely affect. I mean, that's how banks, in a simple sense, work. They take your money and they pay you a small interest rate and they loan it out at a higher interest rate. Now, there are some other things like a certificate of deposit. What that does is that usually specifies a time, and you give up some flexibility, some liquidity. So, it's got a maturity. It's not a demand deposit. You can get it back, but often only with a penalty. Now, in exchange for that, they'll perhaps give you a higher interest rate, but high enough to justify that, or high enough to work, other things out. It's typically not that competitive. I recently had a pretty good sum of money in a brokerage account, and it was just a cash account. Was not at risk, and I was making over 5% on it. So, if you've heard about this Japanese carry trade, this gets kind of down in the weeds. This happened, a couple months ago now, but it's been going on for years and years, where the Japanese had extremely low rates. And so a lot of people, big investors, were taking money out of the Japanese system at nearly a zero interest rate and then invested it all over the world. And the problem occurred when Japan finally started to end that policy and started to actually charge, for those loans, which made those investments less attractive, which meant people had to close out those positions, and so it puts downward pressure on the market. And things can get pretty involved on an international level quite quickly when things like that happen. But it's sort of the big boys playing, but the rest of us get affected when the market tumbles or interest rates go up and the rest of that. Risk-free rate of return. The risk, and reward are correlated. Now, are they perfectly correlated? No, but that's what theoretically they are. The more risk you take, the larger reward you should get. Now, the problem occurs when those things are not correlated, and you're, for example, you think you're in a no-risk position when you actually are, and you're not being adequately compensated for it. I do not, as an investor, I don't mind taking risk as long as there's a commensurate benefit. But anyway, the risk-free rate of return, that's something for a sort of a fail-safe investment. When you look at U.S. Treasuries, those are considered nearly risk-free, because if those investments fail, if the U.S. government fails, well, we've got bigger problems. Your financial situation, your actual safety is going to be at risk. So anyway, normally there's a government rate and there's a risk premium over that. So a prime rate and then a amount that represents risk. Most risk is due to the chance that the investment's going to fail. There's some sort of risk premium associated with it. And interest rates will only get so low until you get down to basically that government risk-free rate. And then any additional risk represents an increase that has to be paid, to counter that. So risk premium, additional return beyond the risk-free rate that can be earned on a deposit guaranteed by the government. So if they're paying you more than that risk-free rate, that's the premium. Now, obviously, the banks, that's the way they make the money, the difference between the two. Individuals with poor credit history pay higher rates because they represent greater risk. The risk to the lender that person's going to flake out because they poor credit history, they probably flaked out before. That's why they get charged higher rates. And so you want to ensure you have good credit, but also you see some of these agencies or something, well, we'll give credit to anyone. Well, that's not somebody I want to do business with. If you'll give credit to anyone, then you have to build in a certain factor that you're loaning to some people who are going to flake out here, and I don't want to be in that group. I used to have insurance with USAA. I still do on some things, but USAA is a big bank, but they broadened out. But at a certain point, they only would insure military officers. Well, it's a pretty select group. An officer, you have to have a college education. If you have a DUI or two, you'll get kicked out. So, I mean, it became if you're going to have auto insurance, it's kind of the crowd that you wanted to be insured by. So, correspondingly, they had low rates. Well, when they broaden that pool now, when they bring on family members and other folks within the military, they open that up to a larger, less exclusive part of the population. I'm not trying to be snobbish here, but I'm just saying that it represents more risk to the insurance company, and everything went up by a little bit in terms of their rates they were charging. Impact to the economy on the risk premium, certainly. Yeah, we're part of the bigger thing. Investors more willing to invest in a favorable economic. Yeah, it goes without saying. So, twisted perception. So, there's a couple of things we'll talk about when we're looking at earning a return. There's investing, and then there's speculation. Speculation, is almost like gambling, and fair enough. It's got an appropriate time and a place, but you would not want your entire portfolio, all of your savings, all of your assets, to be in speculative type things. So, some people are doing, catch up, double up, catch up, and all the rest of that stuff. Even certain aspects, crypto's a big field. It's not all crypto is. Well, it's just about all crypto is more volatile than most investments. But even with the crypto realm, there's some fairly conservative investments. And then there's margined investments where people are using borrowed money on volatile assets. That's kind of a recipe for disaster. So there's nothing wrong with taking risk and even speculating, but it's got to be done sparingly. You don't, whatever. I've done quite a bit of speculation in the past and had some success with it, but that's kind of how I ended up with a fair amount of real estate. Because if I make any money in those investments, I don't want to, be riding what can go up that fast can also go down that fast. So, for example, I think I invested about $3,000 in a company, and it was a fairly sizable. Anyway, it turned into $50,000 within a pretty short time, and so I bought some property up by Chickaloon. And so anyway, you can do that. Property, real estate's always going to be, for the most part, very conservative. Again, it depends on the market. If you're investing in Miami Beach or some, real speculative real estate market, it's going to be a different thing. But for the most part, real estate is fairly cautious and a store of value. But anyway, a mix is kind of what you're looking for. Comparing interest rates and risk. So, risk tolerance. I find, at least from the students, from reading the papers, that most students are very risk averse, but they don't really have a recognition of, number one, just the history of the market, that not all of the market is that risky, and number two, they don't recognize the effect of inflation. You know, if you put your money away, either in your pillow, your gun safe, or a low interest account, that's not necessarily safe. You are, in essence, accepting that you're losing money by virtue of inflation, especially when it's quite high. So anyway, you need to figure out kind of where you are. And also, the worst case scenario is somebody who thinks they have risk tolerance, and then the market goes down, and then they realize, they panic and they sell at the bottom. In just about all cases, and I'll show you some charts where, you know, if you're in the market and the market tumbles, 9 out of 10 times the best thing to do is just sit there. You know, this is so true with Bitcoin. I watch my Bitcoin account go up and down, and the only 2 days that the Bitcoin price matters to me are the day I buy and the day I sell. And everything else is just noise. Not worth worrying about. You know, I'll know when to sell, more or less, and I ended up getting in at a decent price. So anyway, if it wants to go up and down, I don't care. It's kind of entertaining, but I'm not going to stress over it because I'm not selling on those days when it's down. Term structure of interest rates. Yep. So typically, the longer you're willing to tie up your money, like a 5-year CD or something, the higher rate you're going to get. So now on bonds, you know, if it's going to be paying a high rate, banks a lot of times, or mortgage companies, will not want to go as far out because there's too many bad things can happen. For a short-term rate, sometimes they can give you a lower rate, and they're whatever, bond yields can flip and stuff. But if you've got a rate that's quite low, I just took out a loan for 3.5%, which is, it's subsidized is what it is, because it's a farm loan. So if I'm controlling an asset and only paying 3.5% interest on it, and inflation is somewhat high, then to a certain extent, the more I have borrowed, the more I'm making. So it can be interesting. Now, if you're paying 7% on a mortgage, yeah, that's not going to work. So shifts in the yield curve. So that's what they're talking about, bond yields and things like that, where interest rates change. And as we said, firms make a profit by paying a lower interest rate than they charge other customers. And so that arbitrage, that difference between the two is where they make their money, that spread. Monetary policy, so the Fed. So the Federal Reserve, kind of a goofy thing. It's a government controlled type thing. I mean, in terms of the leadership, but it's also pseudo-private. So it's kind of got its feet in both pots. It has a little more control than it probably should. They try to, in essence, manipulate the money supply, but they don't always get it right. In fact, a lot of times they don't. So something like Bitcoin would be outside of that system, and that's why, from a libertarian perspective, that's why a lot of people are drawn to Bitcoin, because they don't feel it can be manipulated by politics. Things like interest rates and, this being an election year, the stock market's, it's not going to probably dive just before the election, because the government, the party in control, can maneuver those rates and artificially manipulate and say understate inflation and things like that to make things turn out. And anyway, there's probably going to be an interest rate cut coming just prior to the election here to sort of goose the economy a little bit. Anyway, they do that by adding or subtracting money from the money supply. How the Fed can stimulate it? Yep, the supply of funds. So trying to get interest rates up or down. Obviously, if interest rates go down, firms, especially in the tech sector, are more likely to, invest. If interest rates go up, you'll see sort of a tech crunch. Government demand. So it's all about controlling the money supply. So it is in competition. If the government's involved in this, they're sometimes fighting for the same money that the business, the private sector would be in there. So anyway, it can set up a bit of a competition. Ideally, market forces would drive all this, but anyway, the powers that be want to be active and want to try to manipulate it, and sometimes it leads to some very strange results. Okay, back to your personal section. What banking service characteristics? So this again will be on the homework, and that will be your homework assignment for this time. It'll be spelled out here on the final slide, but it will be for you to evaluate the different banking solutions to see what works for you. Interest rates, yeah. So for me, like I said, do I care what interest rate the bank? No, I absolutely do not. I don't keep enough money in there to make a dime's worth of difference. Plus, I'm not going to artificially keep more money in there than I want to avoid the fees. I'm going to look for a low fee bank. I'm going to keep the minimum in there, and it's all about convenience and low fees. Let me see, interest rates charged on personal loans. Typically, you can get those from other sources. Many times, if you have an IRA, 401k, you can borrow against your own funds, and then some of the fees charged. Location, if you're going to physically be going in there, there are some things that are very good, and if you're dealing with a lot of small bills or coins, and now you're looking for a business solution. But on a personal level, especially with the advent of things like Venmo and PayPal and other stuff, the notion of having to go into a bank all the time, it just doesn't occur that often, but it depends on your personal needs. Here are some of the rates that they're paying. So, 4%. These will be adjusted down as if rates go down. So you're not necessarily making a bunch here. Let's see what else. And the annual inflation rate. So topped out at about a high of 8%. Now they're saying 4.5 and then 2.3. A lot of times these, as the nature of these things, they'll come out with one rate and they'll adjust it after the fact. And they usually don't say, oh no, inflation wasn't 2.3, it was actually 2.1. No, usually goes higher. And since they're making a forecast, they tend to try and, forecast it low. But as you know from shopping and the rest of it, that inflation is a factor. Also, when they say 4.5% interest or 2.3, this will actually be a bit higher this year. But anyway, when they say that, that's in addition to what's already happened. So, here you had about 5%. Here we had a stated 8%, 12%. So anyway, all these things are additive. So now are up about 20% more. So when you see that in the grocery store, that's why. here's the Dow Jones, and this is what I was talking about in terms of risk tolerance. Let's say you time things, well, this was the top back in the Great Depression. Let's look a little bit more current. Around 2007, we had a big drop. So you were doing well, and then all of a sudden, boom, things dropped off by quite a few points, 10 to 20% correction. If you sold, yeah, you lost a lot of money, but if you stayed in, you didn't have to stay in very long. By 2009, 2010, you were back up even, and then you were back on track. The stock market yields roughly 10% per year is a good rule of thumb. So when you look at those bank rates before, seeing 4%, and that was probably a teaser rate, probably had certain conditions put on it. That's half of what you're getting in the equity markets and the stocks. And then within certain sectors of stocks, you can do quite well. But again, you have to maybe have a little bit more time devoted to doing a little bit of research or picking a good fund. Having a good fund manager, hiring somebody to do that for you through a mutual fund where you're just hiring a fund manager. But anyway, you can achieve far superior results in the market. And if you have a certain, stick-to-itiveness to not panic and not jump out at the bottom, you'll be just fine, especially if you're in it for the long term. If you're somebody who's right here and you're retiring and you're pulling money out, yeah, this could be fairly devastating. But if you're somebody who's not going to retire for several more years, you can ride out those blips and be just fine. Okay, managing your money. It gets back to, now we're looking at just sort of day-to-day operations. So liquidity, as we know, is all about cash and money management over, concerns short-term inflows and outflows. Credit cards for utilities. So interest rates, usually high. Yeah, exceedingly high. But guess what? You don't have to pay them. I mean, if you're undisciplined, yeah, you do. But in terms of comparing, gaining liquidity from cash or liquidity from credit cards, if you're comparing on that sort of basis, if you're using a credit card like cash, you will not be carrying a balance. You'll be a convenience user, and so the high finance charges that's for the other guy, hopefully not for you. Checking account, pretty much a necessity, very liquid. Overdraft protection, pretty much essential. Overdraft protection just means if a check's presented and there's insufficient funds, it rolls onto another account or perhaps onto a credit card. Essentially, when you write a check and you don't have the funds in there, it's a bit of a crime you just committed, and so the banks can charge these exorbitant penalties and rates, and there's not a whole lot you can say about it because, you screwed up. And so if you have overdraft protection, you maintain control, and you don't have to expose yourself to, again, some of those fees that the other guy has to pay. Stop payment of less utility than it used to be. Because checks are processed electronically, there's usually not that delay time. Now, where this can be useful, I've done this before, where, I was taking money for different things, and I was selling products, horse-related stuff, outdoors, and anyway, check got lost. I knew the amount of the check, but I also knew I did not have it. I lost the customer's check. Well, rather than expose that customer to any risk, and obviously I want to still get paid, and the customer was fairly reasonable about it by me just contacting them saying, look, I'd like for you to put a stop payment on that check, meaning that if that check is presented to the bank, it will not be honored, and then they could write me another check without fear that I'm going to, get paid twice. I think their bank charged them $5, which, fair enough, I paid them for that. and that's how that worked. Direct deposit worked. Everybody's familiar with that. That's no longer a novelty. But the fees vary from institution, and no interest on most checking accounts. Yeah, if there is interest paid on a checking account, there's usually conditions that are not something you want to deal with, and it's not going to be a huge rate. Just keep your checking account simple and get your funds that are just sitting there idle and get them invested or get them in a brokerage account and get a higher interest rate. Get it out of the bank for the most part. They have some little buzzwords, now accounts, and they'll have asset management account and money market account. What you're really concerned with is what kind of interest rate am I getting paid and what are the terms, Within banks, most of the time they'll say, oh, do you want a checking and a savings? I don't have a savings account. I don't want a savings account with a bank. It's they don't pay an interest rate that's significant enough. I would rather shift that money over to a brokerage. I can get it just as easily, but I can get an interest rate of a few percentage points higher. So it makes a big deal. Certificate of deposit. Here you're giving up some liquidity. It'll be a 5-year CD, or it'll be a whatever CD, or it may have a dollar figure associated with it as well. Anyway, not a product I'm really interested in because, again, I can get those kind of rates with less restrictions from a brokerage. And a money market. Now, you'll see these money markets and asset management accounts. You'll see those under your brokerage. They can also be offered by banks, but and if they do, they're saying here less liquid than a checking account. My money market account does not have any restrictions on it, so it's equivalently liquid in my mind. What you do if you have a brokerage where you're buying and selling stocks, when you buy and sell stocks, the money that you're going to use to buy those stocks and the money where your proceeds go when you sell something, they go into basically a money market or an asset management account. And if you want to keep a cash position, either for as a emergency fund or just because you're strategically going to buy at some point in the future, you can do that. Most people find it's pretty useful to do a thing called dollar cost averaging, where they'll buy a certain amount of stocks or mutual funds or whatever each month. And that way, if there are price fluctuations, if the price is low, then they buy more shares with the same dollar amount. If the price is high, well, then they buy fewer shares. And in the long run, dollar cost averaging is a strategy pretty common and pretty highly recommended. They say you can't time the market, but I try to learn that lesson over and over again. And sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't. But I'm not so much a dollar cost averaging kind of person anymore. I do tend to buy the dip when I can. Treasury securities. So again, not a lot of risk you're being exposed to because it's backed by the U.S. Treasury. So all kinds of different forms these things will come in. T-bills, other things. Quite safe, but are they going to keep up with inflation? No. Money market funds, they'll put them in short-term securities. Is it insured, for that $250,000? No, most funds in a brokerage of any size are they don't carry that sort of government protection. Now they are protected by the overall strength of these other companies and the underlying company. So I still don't feel like my money's at risk. But yeah, if you have $1 million in some sort of savings account, no, it's theoretically still could be at risk if all the institutions failed, but not typically going to happen. All this stuff where they rent, financial newspapers and online, nobody really. Financial newspapers now may have long-term outlook, opinion pieces, and things like that, but in terms of quotations, on lines, and specifically because you can get charting is what you're more interested in. So this is kind of an old school thing where it's just presented as tabular data. Not very useful. I'd like to see a chart and, assets in millions. When I'm just looking at a single entity here, I want to see a comparison. So 496 sounds like a lot, but compared to what's the competition got? What's the yield of the competition? Maturity, the rest of that. So I want to have a little bit more data than just is available in that. So this is what I was talking about with an asset management account. Sometimes it's a money market account, but a sweep account where balances go to just sort of a parking place between investments. If you're in a brokerage and let's say you've got cash in that account, and historically equities are making about 10%, again, that's a broad statement, but a range of them, many of the indices will do that. You aren't going to typically keep large amounts of cash because you're going to want to keep it invested to participate in the capital appreciation. So they're going to try and split these out. You can to a certain extent, but it's very tough to split out a now versus an MMDA or a money market itself or an asset management account. They're saying a high balance. It depends on the company's policies. There's no agreed on definition of what the balance is. Most brokerages and mutual funds, when I first started investing, it'd always be something like a $500 or $1,000 minimum investment to start out, unless you do some sort of direct debit to the account, and then there was no limit. So they want to get people involved. So typically a high starting balance is not a factor. So the return, they're showing a CD, the longer term CD, and these are all based on terms, checking account. But again, I've had asset management accounts that do better than these, certainly better than a savings account. So I'm not sure if this is completely valid. You have to look at what the institution is offering you, because even the names, some of these acronyms don't necessarily directly transfer between the different institutions. And more about the different types of risk. So the credit risk, that's that margin above the basic risk. This is the part that somebody's going to default, not pay. Interest rate risk, this is due to the changing rates. And then liquidity risk, that could occur as a result of converting into investment or into cash. So CNN.com, not so much. There is, I don't use Yahoo for much, but I do like the charting on Yahoo Finance. Google Finance is pretty good as well. There's also proprietary stuff, and if you have an account with somebody, you can look on there as well. But charting is really quite powerful. At least for me, it's much more intuitive to understand a situation quickly rather than just a stack of numbers. And then they start getting into some of this other stuff: job loss, fewer hours, poor returns. Anyway, people can get themselves into trouble in economic conditions. Again, this is some of the macro stuff that we don't necessarily have control over. And by definition, a money market has perhaps a little bit more risk, but again, the risk of doing nothing is a risk in itself. The risk of having your money wiped away by inflation is a certainty if you do nothing. So just generalized statements. Anyway, interest rates are not low right now. So the slow, steady person who invested in high-quality stocks would have decimated the rest of these other types of investments. Each one of these types of investments has their place, but for large sums of money, there's certain investments that are gonna pay. And high-quality equities, real estate, or a combination of those is typically what's going to work. It's all about risk and return. If you risk, well, you don't risk nothing. If you accept a very low interest rate to avoid risk, but you accept it's not even a risk, it's a certainty of inflation, then the point is to build wealth and have your money work harder than you do. You want to be at a certain point, hopefully by retirement, where your investments are earning more than you do. That's how wealthy people do not get wealthy by working hourly wages. They get wealthy by having enough money to invest. And when that money starts to snowball, then the point of them working any longer becomes trivial, because their hourly inputs are not even comparable to what they're making with their money. Their money is working much harder than they ever could. Yep. Just about allocation. And they're talking about liquidity here. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the term project, and this is just a sample page of Fidelity, Vanguard. There's a whole bunch of these huge brokerage firms that have a lot of good info. You may have seen the personal, the term project in the syllabus, and it's something that's due by the end of the term. It is a paper, a bunch of stuff just strung together by ChatGPT is not going to work for you. What you need is something tailored to your situation to make it useful. So a lot of you may not know what your financial future is going to be, but this is a time to kind of forecast, kind of take a guess, and come up with a plan. And so there's certain things that's going to be different components of your financial plan, and so hopefully through this paper you'll address some of those. You'll look at certain things, and even right now, if you realize, wow, I want to buy a house at a certain point, and I want to invest money, and want to get started early, and how's that all going to work if I'm mired with tons and tons of student debt? The student debt you take out will have to be repaid. So will that slow down your investing? Think about that. And it may even affect the job you take. Certain professions, when the medical field or education field or military, maybe there's debt forgiveness with that debt. So anyway, in terms of the government wiping away that debt, they'll keep throwing that one in front of you from now and forever. It's they try to get people to come to the election to vote for this, and we'll get you that student loan forgiveness. But no, there's a whole lot more people out there who either didn't go to college or did go to college and struggle to pay off that debt, and the last thing they want to do is have their taxes paying for other people to do that. So anyway, you'll look at Social Security. Social Security doesn't pay that much money. They're up front. It's based upon what you pay in, but there's a calculator associated with Social Security, and you can go to their website and you can see how much you would get, and then you can determine whether you could live on that. Life insurance, a lot of scammers, a lot of salesmen out there in the life insurance realm. you need to think about what you need and keep it to that. Another thing is we'll talk about this in the course, but we'll look at different insurance options, what you might want to consider. Look at your career field, see what the income, typically what somebody's going to make in your field. And then look at investments, what kind of portfolio. Some people may be joining the military. Military's kind of unusual in that, they've even changed the retirement plan, but most people in the military do have to have a second career at some point. So that's something to think about as well. We'll look at tax-deferred compensation. So now we're trying to minimize the amount we're going to be paying in taxes. So 401ks, 403bs, typo there. Thrift savings plan, that's a military thing. In these types of investments, you invest money now that you haven't paid taxes on, and then you will pay taxes on it when you go to withdraw it after age 59 and a half. You can get access to it before, but you will have to pay some penalties. So anyway, a lot to it. And so it's just coming up with a plan, and we'll talk about that. And then lastly, the homework. You're going to evaluate these checking options, pick 3 different banks, could be your current bank, whatever, and just kind of do a write-up, a few paragraphs, a half page or so on why, and again, I'm not trying to get you to change banks, but I just want you to kind of know what the field is. If you're paying, say, I don't know, $8-9 a month for a checking account and you can get it free someplace else, or if you're driving all over town to try and get a free ATM when other banks reimburse you regardless of the ATM, there's a lot of differences amongst the banks, and you'd be surprised, and things have definitely changed with the advent of technology. So before we go, though, I want to go to the internet here and show you a couple items. We'll just type it in generally. Most of these things, you don't have to have an account with them by any stretch to get access to some of the information. Fidelity is one of the big boys, so let's just take a look at them real quick. I'm not, shilling for these guys, but you could, if you had an account, obviously you could log in and do the rest of it. But even without an account, when you're looking at that term project and you're trying to come up with what you're going to do in terms of retirement, you can go into here and get an idea, and also in their planning section. Let me see. So retirement. Let's say, you come up with some sort of plan. Here they're going to create something. You might look through this and maybe screenshot something. You don't have to open up. I'm not encouraging you to open up an account. The reason why you want to open up an account with somebody is when you're with a company, or say a hospital, a school, or somebody like that, they'll generally be associated with some mutual fund company. Say it's T. Rowe Price or Vanguard or somebody like that. One of these companies will get in and they'll sell their services. And so if you're going to work for that corporation, in all likelihood, you're probably going to be doing business with that particular company. And they're all pretty much the same in terms of the quality of the services they offer. They're all pretty much located back in Boston. They're East Coast kind of things, but it's all automated. They've all got good products. They sell each other's products, and they have a lot of other information that's available. Long-term care, if that becomes a situation. There's a thing called a 529 account. If I put a 9 in there, I'm not sure. Yeah, 529 college savings plan. So let's say you're going to be saving for college. This will go through and explain how things work. It'll explain how tax deferred works. Just a lot of information that is available. Sometimes it's done by states, but sometimes you don't necessarily need to be in that state. Anyway, you can get a wealth of information off of these sites, and yeah, they'll offer you all this stuff for free, trying to impress you and entice you into doing business with them. And so you can see they're always going to have splashy websites. Here they're also serving some corporate interests, so they kind of want to know where you're at. So to get back to that Fidelity site type thing that we were looking at here, this is more oriented towards folks. So, retirement, taxes, personal finance. I keep harping on retirement. The thing with retirement is you save for retirement for a couple reasons. One, if you're working for a company, there's typically a match, meaning that, let's say you're earning $100,000 a year, and if you'll put in 4% towards your retirement, they'll put in 6%. So, for compared to your coworker who's not participating in that, you're making $106,000 a year because you're getting that $6,000 match, and they're not. Then you put this money in this retirement account, and I've taken loans against, well before I was 59 and a half, loans against my 401ks for everything. There is no question. It's your money. But if you want to borrow against it, you can. And so it's typically you can take up to half of the balance and up to $50,000. So on a number of times. I mean, when I'm running a small business and I need to buy inventory, I'm not going to a bank to get a loan. I'll pull out of my own funds and pay the interest back to me. When I need money for some sort of emergency, there's no application process. I just pull it out of there. I mean, I've done more creative things with retirement money. I came up on a big piece of property that was raw land. You can't, well, more or less raw land. The house was nothing, and the property was like 100 acres. So most banks are going to lend on that. VA, Veterans Administration, or other lenders, they're looking for a ratio between the land, and that's just way out of whack. You're not going to get a loan for that. So I put it under I split up the property and bought it with a 401k. And so I still own the property. I've since taken it out of that status, but forever it said for the benefit of IRA services, for the benefit of my name. And it was my property. I had it tied up. But there were some IRS restrictions. I could derive no personal use from it. So I couldn't put a house on it, but my dogs enjoyed it. My horses ran on it. So anyway, there's lots of creative things you can do. But that place to put your nest egg is in that retirement, because that's where the government has incentivized the savings. So anyway, and then, of course, when it's in those accounts, you can't actually withdraw the money until you're 59 and a half unless there's a hardship. Well, guess what? The only time you really need that money is when there is a hardship, and so you can pull it out of there without the penalty. So if there's some sort of death or illness or whatever, you can get access to that money. So it's a very convenient, tax-advantaged place to keep your money. And hopefully you're going to make it long enough to retire. But when I say saving for retirement, I mean just saving in general, because that's the best place to put it. So anyway, all sorts of little things in here, and you might find a site that their format kind of clicks with you, and good luck. I mean, all this stuff is available. So estate planning means you've passed away, emergency funds, wealth management, education savings, all those things are kind of elements of your term paper. So you can go in here if you're stumped on what should I do. The difference between getting an A on your term paper and getting a C is you saying, I'm going to save $100,000 for my kid's education and leaving it at that. Yeah, that's C level work. If you say, I'm going to put it in a 529, now you're showing some, understanding of the system. And it's legitimate, because let's say you put $100,000 in some savings account for your child for college, and they go to pull it out, 20 years from now or whenever. When they go to pull that out, they're not going to get the full $100,000 because you put it in a normal account and it's fully taxable. And so let's say it appreciated and a lot of that was capital gains. You're going to get taxed at that 15% rate. So they're getting $85,000 at best. Whereas if you just would have designated and put it in a 529 properly, as long as it's used for educational purposes, they get the whole $100,000. So they, in essence, got $15,000 more, and you got a better grade on your paper. So anyway, there's smart ways to do things, and so the assets, the resources are all available, and that's it. So enough of that. We'll talk more about the term paper as we go, but that's it in a nutshell for tonight.